Alright, well, I'm driving around in my 89 Carrera 3.2 here. A little bit of traffic. I was just going to do a sights and sounds video, but I guess I'll talk because I'm in traffic. No fun. So anyway, I wanted to touch on how this car is for, a DIYer who's worked on American cars in the past. Maybe you're a muscle car guy, which that's kind of where I come from. Or ATV, motorcycle guy, also that's where I come from. And how do those skills equate to working on a strange air-cooled rear-engine German car? So the answer is, if you've done that before in the past, touched on that, yeah, you have a good shot at being able to work on the engine of a car like this. So obviously it's all metric, but the way the engine is laid out on this, it's a split case, and it has an individual cylinder with 4 studs per cylinder. So if you worked on a like a 2-stroke motorcycle, Harley Davidson, you're used to like a barrel style cylinder. That's really what you've got. Then a head, and it's a single overhead cam, 2-valve per cylinder. It's actually a semi-Hemi head. So you have less valves, 2 valves per cylinder, just like a Harley Davidson, except it's not a pushrod engine or most American muscle cars. So it would be a little bit of mix of a lot of the things you've worked on in the past. So yes, you'll have a timing chain to run the cam, 1 per bank. That's this guy. But really the difference between this and maybe like a Japanese motorcycle from the 70s, like an air-cooled motorcycle, is a 4-cylinder block would be all 4 cylinders in one casting. This would have individual cylinders. So obviously 2 valves per cylinder equals 12 valves. These do have a manual valve adjustment. But if you've had like a motorcycle in the 70s, if it's it would be similar. So you'd have 8 valves you would do like on a vintage Japanese motorcycle. If you've got a more recent motorcycle with 4 valves per cylinder, you actually have more valves. So 12 valves isn't bad. You access the upper valves actually from the engine compartment, and then the exhaust valves is in a lower separate valve cover, and you kind of do that from the wheel well. Mainly because the valve angle on this engine is very wide. A little bit different. But not that bad. I think it's 0.1 millimeters, the valve clearance. You could just do that with 1/10 of a turn from 0 lash. There's little tools that you can buy that help you do that. But anyway, if you just get into the mindset, if you've had an American car, you do most of the stuff from the top. This car, you essentially just have to get familiar with dropping the engine if you pull the engine, which isn't that hard to do. It's really only 4 bolts. So you kind of lift the car, drop the engine. But I'd say if you have had worked on motorcycles and muscle cars, you have what it takes to do the engine on a Porsche, air-cooled Porsche, like the Carrera 3.2 that I'm driving now. So if you were in the market for a muscle car and you were maybe a little bit afraid of getting into a car like this, you have some pros and cons. You do have a little bit of a learning curve and getting your mind wrapped around just that this car is so much different. But you also have, I think from 1978 on up, you won't have the body issues with rot, rust, all sorts of corrosion problems that you have on a lot of American cars. I know in the Corvette realm, like C2, C3 Corvettes, you've got an ungalvanized birdcage and frame, so that is an issue. C4 and up, those are pretty much good to go with a galvanized frame. But anything from the 80s on back, you have to be very careful of. If you're a DIYer and you don't know how to weld and do body work like me, getting a galvanized car is a much safer bet. So I know my brother had his 67 GTO, had the body work done on it, went through kind of a cycle of going to the car shows, enjoying the car, and then it had to be repeated. And he put a lot of work into it. So this car, a Carrera 3.2, the whole shell, it's a monocoque metal shell, and it's fully galvanized. So that doesn't mean it can't rust. So, that's like a zinc coating on a bolt. If you were to take a little sawzall and put a little cut in it, obviously once you get past the galvanized coating or zinc coating, it can rust. So if these cars were used in an area where there's like a lot of rock chips and things, and the owner did not address it, cover up the nick or whatever if it went through, then yes, it can rust. I also found that there's places, maybe just from chafing or movement on the car, that the galvanizing either was worn off or possibly wasn't applied evenly over the whole car. So, yes, can it rust? Yes. In a rust belt, can any car rust? Absolutely. But you have a less likelihood of rust on a 78 and up Porsche. Especially Carrera 3.2s. They have pretty much a thick undercoating on them, so the chances of them getting pierced, the coating getting pierced is quite low. But one other thing on these you do have to look for the body, that there's no liner in the wheel wells, so stones and things can chip. But point is, overall, it is coated. Even though it can rust, it's much less of a likelihood than other vintage cars. So if you look at, all right, well, Carrera 3.2 is 55, 67, 80,000. Well, think about, in most cases, you won't have to do body work. And if you were to strip a car down to the, an American car, like a frame off and all that, and having to redo body panels, weld and all that, that is a very expensive endeavor. If you had to really restore a car, you're looking at high five figures up to six figures, depending on how much work is done. So think of the price of this car in most cases that you would not have to get into the body work, so then you could focus on mechanicals. So I found that very attractive with these cars. Another thing, if you're a DIYer and you've worked on metric stuff, you have most of the tools you need already. So Porsche is a 10 millimeter, 13 millimeter, 15 millimeter, 17, 19, and there's a few big ones like 32s and things like that for oil lines. But for the most part, 10, 13, 15 is kind of the jive of a Porsche of this era, as opposed to the Japanese 10, 12, 14. So I just basically doubled up on my 13s and 15s, because I kind of keep them at a lot of different places. So some of the advantages to the Porsche, at least, being all metric is, man, I had a Corvette in the 80s, and that was a mix of SAE and metric, so I never really got a good handle on what was what, and it was kind of annoying. But this car, obviously, German straight metric, one tool kit covers it all, and hopefully if you get your car sorted out, you won't really have to use the tools long term. You do a one and done and then try to enjoy the car.